Hello, my name's Simon Brook, and welcome to this, the third in a series of webinars coming to you from the Soke, looking at issues around communication. So we're going to look this time around the question of why men don't want to talk and why they're not great at expressing their feelings. And we're also going to look at how we can perhaps change that and persuade them to open up a little bit more. During the webinar, we're going to introduce you to Charlie and Ed. Charlie, as you'll see in a moment, is trying to get his friend Ed to talk a little bit more about how he feels, but Ed is clearly quite reticent about doing that. So, as in our previous seminars, we'd like you to watch this short scene and think about what's going on. We'd then like you to participate by putting your comments in the YouTube chat. And we'll also take into account what our therapists, Daniel and Holly, have to say. We'll ask Charlie and Ed to rerun the scene using those comments, and we'll see how they get on. So we're conscious that we don't have time to solve all their problems here, just to really offer some food for thought and start a conversation about men and communication, which we hope you'll continue. So have a look at this conversation between Charlie and Ed and let us know what you think. And as I say, we'll then put your comments into practice and see if we can improve the interaction between them. So Charlie, Ed, over to you.
Hi, mate.
Hi.
How are you? You all right?
Yeah. Not bad. You?
Yeah. Good, thanks. How's things?
Same as everyone else. Can't complain.
How's the homeschooling?
Yeah, it's all right with Bella. She's old enough just to get on with it. The twins are the ones that are the nightmare.
Yeah, I've got the same here. Jen's going up the wall. Kids are going up the wall. I mean, we literally had a massive row about some bloke on TV yesterday.
What, you and the kids?
No, me and Jen.
All right. What was the row about?
No idea. Well, she called me Donald Trump. Probably. Haven't had it cut for 3 months. What about you?
Nope, still bald.
Yeah, the world is full of bald guys having the last laugh at the moment. No, I meant what's happening with you? How's Nikki? What's going on at work?
Yeah, all good. I mean, Nikki's having a hard time. Work's a bit full on at the moment, but same as everyone else. What's new in the publishing world?
Yeah, it hasn't been a bad year for publishing.
Yeah. All that fake news can't read itself, can it?
Exactly. What were you saying about Nikki?
Oh, no, nothing. So you've been doing all right then?
Well, with work, yeah, I mean, number of us are all right. It's the people. Half our board meetings are taken up with talking about employee mental health.
Well, they're doing a lot better than the poor sods that have lost their jobs, so they can't really complain, can they?
Well,
Bella's friends' parents at school, like he works in advertising. She's lead designer on some swanky hotel that's being built in Hong Kong. They've both been furloughed since last March. Unbelievable.
Yeah, no, I know, it's terrible. But, we can't tell people they can only complain if they've lost their job or if their parents died. It's all relative.
I'll excuse the pun.
No, I'm serious.
Me too.
So listen, all okay with you and Nikki then?
Yeah. She's not calling me Donald Trump, so I'm doing better than you, my friend.
Yeah, well, it doesn't take too much to be doing better than me and Jen these days.
Oh, well, I'll let Nikki know that.
I'm sure Jen already has. Jen was saying that she spoke to Nikki. She was upset.
What, Jen?
No, Nikki.
What?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Was there something about you not telling her that you had to sort of lay off a whole load of people? I mean, what was all that about?
Sorry, mate. Hold on. I've been summoned. I've got to go.
Yeah. Okay. Look, fine. Look, just call me back. Okay.
Yeah. I'll give you a bell next week.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's that. Difficult conversation there. I wonder what else is going on. So, Daniel, Holly, Daniel, start with you first of all. Is that typical of the kind of mismatch in a conversation there between two men where we don't really get to the heart of the matter?
Well, I think it has a ring of authenticity to it, the exchange between these two men. It feels there's a sense of sadness, I think, that they don't ever seem to really get to a point of contact between the two of them. And I suppose I was left wondering, particularly about Ed, about whether or not he really knows what he feels about things. I think that's very common. When certainly in the consultation room at the beginning of therapy, men often have an experience where if you ask them how they feel about something, they often don't really know how to answer that question. I was really struck by him saying at the beginning that he can't complain. Obviously, that has two meanings to it. He feels that he doesn't have the right to complain, but also whether or not he knows how to really articulate and how to talk about his inner world.
Thanks, Daniel. And Holly, I sensed sort of some slight embarrassment there, really. Ed almost saying to his friend, don't go there, don't push me on this. Again, is that something that you see men tending to do?
It's a very difficult thing to be, well, twofold. One is to be asked how you're feeling, I think is difficult, and then to respond to that. Back to Daniel's point that sometimes you just don't know. So a good tip, something good to do would be to ask again. Ask twice. This notion that the first time, sometimes it's easy to get around it, but yet if you ask again, there's a little bit more responsibility and some time for reflection when you can actually see, maybe I do need to ask myself that question as well.
That's interesting point there. I think sometimes we feel slightly embarrassed, don't we, about sort of revisiting something, and perhaps we assume if somebody hasn't answered the question, it's because they don't want to, but then perhaps it is they do want to, but they're just they need a bit of extra encouragement or something.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right, so we're getting some comments from the audience here. People saying that this is as you said, Daniel, this is a familiar scene. In fact, somebody's pointed out that, of course, this conversation is going on over Zoom, over a remote situations, which is difficult. But I wondered as well how the characters themselves feel. Charlie, let me turn to you first of all. So conversation there. I imagine this is the kind of thing you do a lot with your mates. How was that for you?
Yeah, look, I'd say it was reasonably typical of the type of conversations that we have. For the most part, they serve really just exactly as they're intended, really, just to sort of check in with each other and see how life is. But I guess it's almost intended as finding out really on a surface level as opposed to something that's a lot deeper.
Yeah, interesting. And Ed, how did you find that conversation? Was it one that you were keen to talk about, or did you feel relaxed, or what was your feeling about that?
It came in two halves, really. I mean, initially it was just kind of, surfacey stuff. How are you? How are the kids? That was okay. I felt a little bit towards the end like Charlie was trying to get at something, and I didn't. Yeah, I didn't feel comfortable at all. I wanted to kind of get out of there, if I'm honest, since it started to get a bit serious. Yeah. So
Charlie's trying to get at something. Why would he? And it's getting a bit serious. Why would he be doing that, do you think? And what's the problem there?
Okay, well, the issue is that work's been pretty rough for me recently. I own a company and it's not doing very well. Contracts have been cancelled and it's pretty rough. I haven't told him. So clearly, when he said that, Nikki's mentioned to Jen about it, I was like, he's going to be annoyed. He's going to be angry at me for starters. And to be honest, he's my mate, but we have a bit of competition at times. Blokes, like, how are you doing? I know that he's doing great. His business is publishing has been, booming, and I feel a bit embarrassed about being honest about how bad things are going for me on that side. So yeah, uncomfortable.
Interesting. Okay, so we are going to get some comments there from the audience. Just before we do that, Daniel, just wanted to come back to you. Competition between men. There's clear competition, especially around work, and that's certainly something that I've noticed that resonates with me. Sometimes I do it myself and I can't help it. But again, is that something you're seeing in the consulting room?
Sure, I think that's absolutely. I think it can inhibit conversation between men when there's a sense that when there's a sense of, I suppose I describe it as rivalry, as well, competition, and how to address that when, or how to have a conversation about that, an open conversation about that can be very difficult indeed between friends, I think. But that's certainly something that would be talked about in the consultation room. Okay,
interesting. Holly, again, do you think, I mean, is it just a cliche that men tend to be more competitive than women in these sort of situations, or again, is this something you see from your practical experience?
I think everybody has competitive feelings, men and women both. How they compete is different. How that gets expressed as well is different. So we'll often see competition happening more comfortably sometimes for men on the sports field, and for women they compete in a very different way, how they interact, how they discuss things. But it's definitely challenging, and something, again, that can be addressed and should be addressed in the consulting room with allowing somebody to not feel the shame that often gets associated with admitting feelings of competition.
Interesting that we saw Charlie interrupt Ed at the beginning there. And I think the psychological research shows that men are more willing to interrupt than women. But Ed, coming back to you before we get more from the audience, how did you feel about being interrupted? Did you notice that? Did it annoy you?
Yeah, I clocked it. Yeah, Charlie did interrupt me mid-flow, but it happens. It did not rankle me, but it was a little bit of a, all right, okay then, you go on, mate. But it's fine. We haven't talked in a while, so there's also a little bit of us both wanting to get our news out, I guess. So it wasn't major, but yeah, I did spot it.
Okay. Another question we've got here. George asking a very interesting point, I think. How do you go about changing the tone between friends, moving from that sort of light chat to something more personal? Holly, over to you again on that one. I mean, I think my sense, again, I might be wrong, my sense is that women are better at doing this than men. But is there a way of moving from the sort of, hi, how are you? You look well, to getting into the heart of the matter, if you like?
Such a good question. It's difficult to do that. And again, some people are better at it than others, regardless of gender. But again, to be able to offer the space so that somebody can actually respond, and to give them the opportunity to really connect, and to allow them to go a little bit deeper, that silence really can afford a lot of possibility. But it's often difficult in friendships, especially. Silences are not really, we're not used to them. We're used to sort of, throwing in our own information and talking about ourselves and bringing things back to ourselves. Whereas in the consulting room, there is a real emphasis on allowing space and allowing silence, but it's not often seen just in natural dialogue.
It is interesting, that, isn't it, being comfortable with silence and encouraging people to do that, I suppose, as well. Question for James here. James says, do you think that some guys avoid asking how others are because they're not sure about how to respond or support that? I mean, I suppose if you ask your friend how they are and they really tell you, do you then know what to do? Daniel, is that something you think that men can sometimes be a bit nervous about?
Certainly, I think there are sort of the perceived social male stereotypes are that the idea of having some control or having an idea about what's really going on. And I'm afraid you're opening up a question of complete uncertainty when you ask a question like that. And you may be left with something that takes time to work through and to understand. So yeah, I do agree with that. I think that's difficult.
Another question here. David says, I'm not particularly empathetic, very honest of him. Can you learn empathy? Again, Holly, is this, I mean, obviously your job as a therapist is all about empathy, I suppose, but is it something those of us who are sort of not in the profession, if you like, is it something that we can develop ourselves, do you think?
Absolutely. To be able to take the other person's perspective and to be able to really genuinely listen and understand what somebody else is trying to say without preparing what we want to say next is definitely a skill to learn, and a very important one, I think. And it tends not necessarily to be, these are not things that are taught in school. These are things that are, yes, some people have more natural tendency towards being empathic and empathetic. But it is something definitely worthwhile to learn. People around you, relationships improve when you can take somebody else's side and really understand what they're going through.
And putting yourself in their shoes, I suppose. Okay.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, I think we're going to move now. I think we should move now anyway to getting Charlie and Ed to redo the scene a little bit. We're going to look at it from Ed's point of view to start with. So I wondered, Daniel, from your point of view, if Ed does feel that his friend is, there's a bit of competition here and perhaps that his friend is pushing him in a way that he's not keen on. Any thoughts about how Ed, from this point of view, from this first scene, any points about how he should perhaps change his behaviour slightly?
I mean, one interesting question. I think that Ed is really struggling, and I'm thinking about what it would be, how challenging it might be. But I would invite him to take the plunge in some ways and really try to be honest about how he's feeling. And if he's unable to actually say that, to actually say how he's feeling, to say that he's struggling in knowing what that might be, or to put that into words, that at least is a start, I think.
Sounds interesting. Holly, it would be quite a struggle for a lot of men, quite a challenge for them to admit that they're not feeling great or something. But do you think that's, is there sometimes a sense of relief when they do that, do you think?
Definitely. I think to be able to first of all, to be asked by someone who genuinely cares is a very containing feeling for anyone to have. So yes, I think the answer to that is there will be relief when somebody asks that question and our answer have the opportunity to be heard.
Okay, all right. Great, thank you. So let's run the scene again now, and this time my challenge to, well, not my challenge, but I suppose really the therapist challenge, and you, the audience, the challenge that you've given Ed is perhaps to be a little bit more honest and to express perhaps even some vulnerability or something. Can you just say to your mate, Charlie, that actually, no, things aren't great? So let's run that scene again. And what I'll say to the audience, very importantly, is that if you think it's going wrong, or if you think you've got a good bit of useful advice that you could offer to either character, principally Ed in this first go, if you've got some advice you could offer, then please do just type stop in the chat on the YouTube channel. We'll stop the scene and then we'll replay it. So if you think that you'd like to introduce something as we run this scene again, then just write stop. But all right, I'll invite our actors to take over again. Ed, Charlie, off we go again.
Hi, mate.
Hi, how you doing?
How are you? You all right?
Yeah, not bad. You?
Yeah, no, I'm good, thanks. You know, how's things?
Yeah, I guess it's the same as everyone else, right? You know.
Yeah.
Can't really complain.
No, it's pretty difficult at the moment. Homeschooling, how's that?
Yeah, you know, I mean, Bella's all right. She's old enough just to get on with it. It's the twins that are a nightmare.
You tell me about it. I've got the same thing here as well. Jen's going up the wall, kids going up the wall. I mean, we actually had a massive row about some bloke on the news yesterday.
What, you and the kids?
No, me and Jen.
Oh, wow, what was the row about?
No idea. But she did call me Donald Trump.
It's the hair.
Yeah, probably. Haven't had it cut for 3 months. What about you?
No, I'm still bald.
Yeah. World is full of bald guys having the last laugh at the moment. Now, I mean, what's happening with you? How's Nikki? What's going on at work?
Yeah, so-so. I mean, Nikki's having a hard time, works a bit full on, same as everybody. What's new in the publishing world?
Yeah, look, I mean, it hasn't been a bad year for reading.
All that fake news ain't going to read itself, is it?
Exactly. What were you saying about Nikki?
Oh, no, nothing really. But you're doing okay then, yeah?
Yeah. I mean, work. I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, numbers were fine. It's people, half-hour board meetings are taking up with employee mental health.
Well, they're doing a lot better than all the poor sods that have lost their jobs. Okay, so they really can't complain.
Well,
Bella, her best friend's parents at school. He works in advertising. She's the lead designer of some swanky new hotel in Hong Kong, I think. They've both been furloughed since March. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
We've got to stop here, guys. Sorry, or the stop's come in already. So Harriet says that Charlie keeps taking things back to himself, after asking a question. So certainly Ed is quite complicit in that in a way, isn't he? He's quite happy to hand it back to Charlie, but obviously, if Charlie really wants to know how his friend Ed is, then we do want to put more emphasis or give more of an opportunity for Ed to say what he wants to say. So again, coming back to our experts, Daniel and Holly. Daniel, is that for men quite often a defense thing to throw over to you? Anyway, how are you? And are other men in this situation quite happy to talk about themselves rather than focusing on their friend, do you think?
Look, I don't want to underestimate how hard I think it is for Ed to talk about what's actually going on. I noted, I sort of sensed from him a desire to try and talk about something that's troubling him, but he's really finding this very, very difficult. And I think it's obviously contributed by the way that Charlie's interacting with him too, but you're right, there's a deflection process that's going on through humor and through trying to pass the emphasis back on to Charlie again. He's struggling, I think, struggling to say what's on his mind.
I'm wondering, Holly, perhaps this comes back to an earlier point you were making about not being afraid to ask the same question twice. If you don't get an answer, you don't have to do it aggressively, of course, I suppose, being the Jeremy Paxman, but you can come back to that question and repeat it. Is that the kind of thing you think we could do here successfully?
I think that would be really useful to ask the question again, so that we can open up some space and leave him to respond, or at least give him another option to do so. Okay,
all right. So another point here that one of our audience has made a mention of is that we had sort of two questions coming in here at the same time. It's sort of how's Nikki, how's work sort of thing, and it can reduce focus. Any thoughts on that? Again, coming to you on that one, Daniel. Any thoughts on sort of two-part questions, if you like? How's this, how's that, how's whatever? Does that mean that we can't actually answer any of those questions in effect?
Well, I think I want to echo what Holly said, which is about creating some space in the session. And I suppose there's something about thinking more about how Charlie's responding and asking questions, and perhaps not listening. That may sound a bit critical, but I think it's that there do seem to be quite a few questions being fired, but they're going in both directions. that no one's really making any contact with each other at all. Is what that feels like.
Another, Vince has a good point here. I think it's something actually I've noticed as well, that men, he says, men tend to like to provide solutions. Oh, so the concept of simply listening is not so common to them. Is that, Holly, is that a sort of male practicality thing? You know, that if somebody, a friend perhaps says that they're not doing really well and that they're struggling with life at the moment, we tend to, as men, try to offer, you know, solution to do X, Y, and Z or something rather than just listening?
Yes, it is. It's very common. And it's this need on their part, if you will. And again, we're completely generalizing when we say this, but it does tend to be a trait that men exhibit, where there's a desire to fix. You know, there's a problem, and there's often a feeling that there must be a solution, and that it's also their responsibility to offer that solution. You'll often see this in couples too, where one person wants to just share something that's going on and be listened to and be heard and to be offered that space. And the other person hears that and perhaps feels some anxiety around the need to fix it. And that's, you know, we often get a mismatch with communication that way.
Okay. All right. So, so just before, let's just run this scene once more before we turn it over to Charlie and look at things from his point of view, and what he needs to do. But so Ed, obviously not happy or feeling uncomfortable, if you like, perhaps about expressing some sort of vulnerability here or things not being great. So how can he, as I say, express that vulnerability and things and signal to his friend Charlie that he is willing to talk if Charlie knows how to do it, if you like? How can men invite another male friend to let them talk a bit? Daniel, what advice would you give to Ed before we run this scene again?
I think it's about taking the plunge. I think it's about being brave enough and risk, feeling able to take the risk, I think. And I don't want to underestimate how hard that can be. I think it can feel really challenging, but I would really invite him to do that, because I think he may find it very rewarding. He may find that he ends up developing a friendship and feeling connected with someone in a way that he's not currently experienced. And I suppose I just have to think about the fact that men are more likely to commit suicide than women, and they are more likely to be more isolated. And I think there's something that's really significant. There's a significant social problem, I think, that we have to confront and think about carefully. And I wonder whether this is partly contributed. You know, there's something to do with the relationships that men have with each other and with other people that we really need to address. And it is a problem that needs to be taken seriously.
Absolutely. So we'll need to, people in Ed's situation who perhaps are struggling, do men in particular need to somehow to be relaxed about expressing how they feel to friends and family, so that it doesn't come all crashing down on them, I suppose. So, all right, Ed, so here's your challenge. I know this is going to be a difficult one for you, exactly, but we're going to run the scene again. But this time we want to just experiment, see if you can just be a little bit more honest and just say, actually, things aren't great. And then, of course, it'll be interesting to see how Charlie reacts when his friend does sort of express that vulnerability. Again, audience, if you think that you can see something going wrong, if you've got a really good idea that you think we should introduce, then do just put stop in the YouTube chat at any moment, and we will stop the scene. But okay, so over to you again, Ed and Charlie. Ed, to be a little bit more open and express some of that vulnerability.
Hi, mate.
Hi. How you doing?
Hiya. You all right? How's things?
Yeah, you know, not bad. You?
Yeah, good, thanks. Yeah. How's things?
Yeah, you know, same as everyone, really. You know, I suppose I can't complain.
Okay. How's homeschooling?
Yeah, I mean, Bella's all right. She's kind of old enough just to get on with it. The twins are a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah, absolutely. Got the same here. You know, Jen's going up the wall, kids going up the wall, and we literally had a massive row about some bloke on the news yesterday.
Okay, so we've got a stop here from somebody. I'm going to stop you for a moment. We've got, Jane says that the problem is very often that men don't leave enough space between conversations. So perhaps Charlie, once Ed has expressed some concerns and been a bit honest about how he feels, do we have that pause? So why don't we run the scene again, and very briefly, this just see what Ed can do to express how he feels and be a bit honest about it. And I suppose see if Charlie is willing to allow a pause before he dives in there. Off we go.
Hey, mate. You all right?
Hi. Yeah, I guess. How about you?
Yeah, no, I'm good, thanks. How's things?
Well, I suppose you're not really allowed to complain at the moment, are you? So I'll say it's all right.
Yeah, no, I know. It is a bit like that. I know. Yeah, not gonna lie. Tough times. You just sort of got to get our heads down and get on with it. Really. How's things on the homeschooling front?
Yeah, I mean, Bella's all right. She's old enough just to get on with it. The twins are a nightmare.
I've got absolutely the same here as well. I've got to say, Jen's going up the wall, kids going up the wall. We actually had a massive row last night about some bloke on the news yesterday.
What, you and the kids?
No, me and Jen.
All right.
Okay. So we've got a stop has come in, and Paul is suggesting that actually Ed shouldn't let Charlie get on and change the subject and move on a bit, that Ed should assert himself and just say that actually that he wants to talk a little bit more. What we're going to do now is just look at things a little bit more from Charlie's point of view, and just see how he can encourage Ed to say to really say how he feels and have that kind of honest conversation that I think everybody would like to have with family and friends, and that we know certainly that men need to have more of. Certainly, when we, as you were saying, Daniel, with regard to these shocking statistics over the last few years about men and suicide. So, okay. So any thoughts for Charlie? One thing that somebody has suggested to Charlie, that he is more willing to pause and allow silences. So we've sort of touched on this, but Holly, silence, you must have this in the consulting room. Is it embarrassing? Is it something, are men more likely to want to try and fill the silence with chat than women, do you think?
On that point, I don't necessarily think that it's a gender thing per se. I think silence is very difficult to tolerate for most people, especially more in a friendship when there's a natural way of having a dialogue. It's difficult. It's just difficult to sit in that space. People don't know what to do with it, and so they fill it, and they fill it often with their own views and their own agenda around having a conversation. So it is something that as therapists too, we need to get over that discomfort too in being in that silence with someone and trying to fight the urge to not necessarily fill it. There's a lot of training that has to go into that, and a lot of comfort with self in order to be able to offer that. So it's not surprising that people have a challenge with it.
Interesting, thank you. Daniel, from your point of view, Henry has posted a comment here, which is quite interesting, I think, given the sort of the current political economic situation as much as anything else. He says, I don't want to be a downer in conversations. I want to appear on good form, as there's enough negativity going around at the moment. I suppose that might be a concern that both sexes, perhaps men more than women, I don't know, we might be a bit worried that if we start telling people that we're not feeling great, we are a bit unhappy about ourselves or whatever, that we might be seen as a bit miserable and not the kind of person that people want to spend time with. How do we overcome that fear, do you think? And is it valid?
I think that's a very common fear. I think there's a worry that others can't bear what it is that we may bring. certainly clients have that anxiety that they are bringing something that perhaps they can't manage, and they anticipate that others won't be able to manage it too. Yeah.
And another point here, I don't know what you think about this, Daniel, but Stephanie has pointed out or suggested that this thing of deflecting, in other words, I don't want to go there, don't ask this. She says it's not exclusive to men, women do it too. Daniel, do you think, I mean, obviously women do it, but do you think, do men do it more? Do women and men do it in a different way? How does deflecting work, and how can we overcome it if we think that somebody does, we need to sort of pursue a conversation with a friend, if you like?
I think it's common to both genders. I'm not entirely sure I can say that it works one way for men and one way for women, if I'm honest. But I think that what I'd be really keen to know is what's really going on here. I think, as I said before, it seems that there's no real contact being made, and I think that if that's something that you can observe that's going on in a conversation, I think I'd really be asking myself, what's not being talked about? What are we avoiding?
Yeah, absolutely. Holly, I mean, deflecting is something you must see a lot in your practice with people worried about a conversation going too deep or into a particular area they're not yet prepared to go into and discuss. How subtly do you handle in your practice that the deflection thing?
I think there does have to be a readiness around being able to understand perhaps why we're deflecting and what the avoidance is about. So, whether you can gently bring the person back to the situation that they are deflecting from, and to be able to be with them in that uncomfortable place, because that's what essentially is the reason for that, right? That there's something really uncomfortable about being in that place or addressing that issue. And consequently, how do I get out of this? So if you can gently guide them back to that place and establish a bit of a trust where they can take the plunge and actually say, okay, maybe I need to look at this. Maybe I need to be a little bit more honest here too. And can I risk that now with the person that I'm with? Can this friend be trustworthy enough to talk? Or can this therapist and I, do we have that level of trust where I can take that initiative?
Interesting. We talked a couple of times actually about silence. So I think one of the interesting points that we're getting from the audience is this idea of silence, giving people space. So Daniel, if we run this scene again and we ask Charlie to allow a few more pauses to do what he can to get Ed to open up a bit more. As I say, people are frightened of silence, but any thoughts about how would you advise Charlie to introduce that silence and make it seem sort of comfortable to give Ed permission rather than making it sound like part of some kind of interrogation technique, if you like, or something?
Well, I have a question for Charlie, actually, which is I'm wondering what's going on for him. I'm really intrigued what's happening at the beginning of this conversation, because I think it sets the tone for what happens later in some way. And I think I'm wondering if we could ask Charlie that question about what's happening at the beginning of this conversation, what's really on his mind. Because it does, you get a sense that he's also trying to use the conversation to offload something too, which is obviously is part of the way in which everyone relates to each other. But I'd be interested to hear from him directly.
Okay, well let's do that. Charlie, so you're talking to, you called your best mate or whatever. So what's the thinking behind it? Why have you decided to do this?
There's a few things at bay. I suppose the most immediate thing, and to Daniel's point at the beginning of the conversation, is that I'm feeling particularly worked up about the row that I had last night with Jen. The kids were involved as well. A general sort of family bust-up disruption, but particularly with Jen as well, because it seemed to be almost a row over nothing, like I suppose some of the worst rows are. But it did carry some impact. So I guess that's what's at the forefront of my mind at the beginning of the conversation. There is also buried underneath, the fact that I know that there's stuff up with Ed as well, which he's not really confided in me. So there's that's certainly sitting underneath.
Okay, so was your decision to call Ed, was that to just unload a little bit about what's happening in your life, your frustrations, annoyances at home, or was it to see how he is, or was it a bit of both, do you think?
Yeah, I think, look, it's fair. It's not necessarily with the conscious intention of phoning up to download. It's, we're good friends, we talk a lot, so I guess I feel the need to want to speak to a close mate in general. I feel that need, whether it's as conscious as me saying I'm contacting him so I can download about Jen or not, it doesn't feel like it's that, but it's certainly very present.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. Interesting. So let's rerun the scene again. I'm picking up a couple of things that we might ask you to do. The first is this silence business. Can we have a pause? Charlie, are you going to be able to just pause and have a bit of empty space, if you like, in the conversation to see if Ed is then feeling more comfortable and willing to talk a bit more? And then the other thing, I suppose, is you want to say something, Charlie, don't you? But you also know you need to speak to Ed. So can we see how you can perhaps manage that conversation where you both get an opportunity in this conversation to talk a little bit about how you feel? Okay, so let's balance it up. So, all right, let's run the scene again. And again, audience, if you want to stop at any point, just put stop in the chat and we'll halt and take into account your thoughts and observations. So, Charlie, Ed, off we go.
Hi, mate.
Hi, mate. How you doing? Right.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, been better, but how about you?
Yeah, good. Yeah, good. How's things?
Yeah, I guess it's the same as everyone else, really. So can't complain. Well, I mean, I probably could complain if you gave me the chance, but you kind of feel like you got to soldier on, don't you, at the moment?
Yeah, look, I mean, of course there is a bit of that. What's going on?
I mean, homeschooling's a bit tricky, I guess. That's one thing. Bella's great. She's kind of old enough to get it. Twins are a nightmare, and if I'm honest, I'm probably a bit short at the moment. So as much as they're not focused, I'm probably not helping them because I'm I'm a little bit my fuse is a little shorter than it normally is. So it's not. I guess it's not a great concoction, is it? How about you?
Yeah, look, mate. I understand that. I think there's a lot of it around. Certainly, what I'm hearing at work as well. I think you've just got to hang in there, and it's the end is sort of starting to come in sight a little bit, isn't it? I guess we've all got to just sort of hunker down a little bit.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's true. Yeah. I mean, how about you?
Yeah, look, I mean, not much different, really. I mean, it's we're having ridiculous rows about absolutely nothing. In a case in point, last night, something off the telly, I don't even know what. We ended up having a row about it.
Stop it again now, gentlemen. Thank you very much for that. Just before we go to the comments we had about that and request for a stop, Ed, how did that feel for you? Did you feel you had more space to talk?
Yeah, I did actually. It was kind of weird. I was just expecting the conversation to flow like it normally does, and then Charlie just kind of sat there and stared at me, and I was like, oh, I suppose I better say something. It was a pressure, but not like a bad pressure. I just felt like, oh, okay, then I'll carry on speaking, and I ended up probably saying more than I thought I would at the start of the conversation, if I'm honest.
Interesting. So pressure, but not a bad pressure.
Yeah.
Charlie, from your point of view, you did as we said and introduced the pause. How did having that silence feel for you, and what did you think of the response that came about because of it?
So I'll be honest, the silence was hellishly uncomfortable. It's certainly not the way that I normally communicate. Certainly not with Ed either. We're sort of both sort of firing in, I guess, normally. So it was it was pretty uncomfortable. As for what came out, look, I've known Ed for a long time, so I guess it's stuff that I know that's there. It's not, we don't always get into things that deeply. It didn't put me off that much. It was sort of interesting to hear him talk about it. I guess I've naturally felt an inclination just to sort of, make it all right and, tell him to hang on in there.
Okay, interesting. Okay, thank you for that. So some progress there in that Ed obviously felt more willing to talk. We've got an interesting point here from Sophie, who says, and I think a lot of people will recognize this, it's a sort of couples situation. I noticed that their wives are friends too. My husband says he can't talk to his best friend anymore because he's worried that whatever they talk about will get back to his friend's wife and then to me. So Daniel, I'm conscious we're going to have to lose you shortly because obviously you've got to go and see a client. But from your point of view, that situation where you get other wives gossiping and those sort of wheels within wheels of conversation, how do you handle that?
I mean, I'm not sure that I see that or I totally buy into the idea. I can understand the idea, and I think it may play a part at one level in why it is that some men don't choose to talk to their partners. But I'm sort of conscious that I think there may be other things that are going on at the same time, a reluctance to deal with things that feel a bit more uncertain, unresolved. I suppose it may happen. I think it's an interesting idea, but I think I'd be thinking that there's something else going on at the same time.
Could be extra tensions in the friendship and the relationships between the four there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Holly, we've got an interesting question here from Sarah, which I think a lot of us will be able to recognize. How do you recognize triggers during a chat, i.e. moments when you should go and ask those difficult questions? Because this is what you do all the time, I suppose. Of course, is there little things around comments, language, body language, or something that we can look out for?
Yeah, absolutely we can. And I will say that given the times and the fact that we are even doing this webinar currently on Zoom, we lose so much of that, don't we? We lose so much of the body language and the external communication that all we can rely on really is the dialogue. And so we are limited from that standpoint. But in terms of understanding, yes, so the deflection or the capacity to not really get to the heart of the matter, I think is a really, really important one. I also just want to bring up, if I may, a point that was made around, this idea between Ed and Charlie, which I think you did great on this last one, by the way. Very, very nice to see you managing that silence. But this notion of soldiering on and just how much of a message that is, a cultural message, as well as a societal message, this importance of making sure we just, soldier on and don't deal with what we might feel, because to do so would indicate all kinds of messages around what masculinity is and what it means to be a man in society. And so I think I really wanted to touch on that point and give it the space and the importance that it really does require, how difficult being emotional and expressing ourselves as men have.
Absolutely. Daniel, I know we've got to lose you now because you need to go and see a client. Just if you don't mind, just a couple of sentences on advice you'd give to men and perhaps their friends to get them to open up before you have to leave us.
Yeah, I just want to say how positive I felt the last go was. I felt that something different happened, and I suppose I was just observing some of Ed's discomfort during the conversation, but that I felt that something quite different was said. And Charlie had a sense of the agony of the silence, but actually it didn't feel as great as I think he may have. It didn't seem to be as long anyway as I think he may have experienced it to be. It felt he was only giving a small amount of space, and yet him doing that, I think, made a profound impact on the conversation that they were able to have.
interesting. We sometimes feel worse about it ourselves, don't we, than others do, or whatever. Daniel, I know you've got to go and see a client, but thank you very much for your time. I do appreciate it. I'm sure we all do. Thank you.
Fascinating.
All right. Good. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Great. So we'll, as Daniel leaves us, we will run the scene again as we've done before. We've got more comments. Oh, interesting comment here. I think this is something you were sort of mentioning as well, Holly. Sabrina says, it feels like men can't pick up each other's cues. I think it's amazing to hear men gloss over everything they're discussing. Again, this might be a bit of a cliche, but are men, do you think, less good at sort of picking up on the cues in a conversation, even body language or something, which might suggest that somebody wants to say more than they're saying, that there might be more underneath the surface than is immediately obvious?
Some men definitely do that more. And I believe that has a lot to do with how comfortable they are themselves and how versed they are in paying attention to these cues and noticing them and stopping to actually pick up on them. So sometimes it's that they don't have that language or that capacity, and other times it's that they just go over it. It's just not something that they're comfortable enough to go into.
Okay, we've got a few more questions here. Sophie is asking, are there good questions that are the useful questions that you can put to men or to women in a situation which will allow them to open up? So I suppose if you are having a conversation with your friend and you sort of suspect that they do want to say something but they can't do it, obviously nobody wants to put them on the spot or something, but is there a kind of conversation you have, a kind of question that you could recommend that might give people permission, if you like, just to say, actually, I'm not feeling great, things aren't brilliant? What would you recommend?
I would leave open-ended questions. So not yes and no questions, but questions that give people more space to answer that, so that they don't have to make a yes or no answer to that. And being reflective, again, repeating back what somebody is saying so that it puts a mirror up to what they have just said, because a lot of the times we don't even remember what we say in conversation. So sometimes just reflecting it back in exactly the same language that they have used, and you will see in that moment that you've been heard, or that the person has actually taken in what it is that they've said.
Absolutely. So I suppose it's interesting because the really open question is how are things, whatever, but very often we don't want the answer to be too honest, do we? When we say how are things, how are you, how's it going, almost the implied reply is, yeah, fine, thanks, okay. So I suppose there's a balance between that really bland open question and then the really sort of specific question. But do you know what I mean? You can get something that is still open and allows people to say something, but makes it clear that I'm interested in an answer which is beyond just, yeah, fine, thanks, how are you?
Absolutely. And I think, Simon, what you're bringing up is the difference between, politesse and just brief conversation and superficial, how are you, versus how are you? Okay, so they're different. I know it might seem like it's the same thing, but intonation changes and eye contact so that you can really ask somebody that. Now, you're not going to speak to, your barista that way in the same way that you're going to talk to a good friend, but there are different levels of conversation, and having a conversation with a friend is very different than having just a cursory, polite, conversation where you just ask the question, you don't really even want the answer, if you will.
Sort of, how are you? Yeah, exactly, as you say, with somebody in a coffee shop or something. So, okay, well, let's rerun that scene. And my challenge to you, or the Holly's challenge as well, I suppose, the audience challenge plus the audience as well. The challenge for you, Charlie, is to see if you can ask a question which makes it clear to Ed that, as I say, it's not just the hi, how are you, I'm fine, thank you, nor the sort of putting him up against the wall and interrogating him. But is there an opening conversation, some questions that will say, I really do want to know how you are? Does that make sense? Perhaps we can find a way of doing that. And Ed, it'd be interesting to see how you would respond to that perhaps more honest how are you sort of question. So again, audience, if you have any thoughts, observations, do hit stop, and we'll be happy to halt it and take on board your comments and advice. So Charlie, Ed, over to you.
Hi, mate.
Hi.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, been better. You?
Yeah, no, look, I'm good. Don't sound great. How are things?
Um. Yeah. I mean, I guess the same as everyone else. So, can't complain. I suppose.
Suppose.
Right. Jeez. Okay. Well, it's just you gotta crack on. I guess things aren't great. They're not great for a lot of people, are they? But we're all being told that it's not long now, so one final push. But it's things are still tough, aren't they?
Yeah, look, mate, that's absolutely the case. It is tough. It's tough for everyone. It sounds like it's particularly tough for you at the moment. What's going on?
It's nothing. It's all right. It's nothing I can't take care of. It's just things a bit rough. Everything's kind of the homeschooling's a bit tricky with the kids. Bella's fine. The twins are a nightmare, and I've probably been not great with them. I mean, I have a go at them for not being focused on what they're doing, and I'm hardly practicing what I preach at the moment, if I'm honest.
Stop there. And a really nice comment from James, who says it's really interesting to see how Charlie is clearly more comfortable with pauses now, and that is allowing Ed to talk a bit more. And I also noticed a bit more of, interesting, Ed, how you were, well, both of you actually were sort of echoing phrases and picking up on words. So Charlie, did the pauses seem less painful this time around than they were last time, do you think?
Yeah, I almost hate to admit they actually did feel less awkward. It felt a bit more natural, and I think I was a lot more genuinely sort of tuned into the kind of the distress that Ed was in. Whereas, not that I would have ignored it before, but I might have, I guess, more easily skated over it. And actually, when I really did tune into where he's at and focus on it, it is actually easier to afford the space for him to step into.
Interesting. And I noticed both of you were repeating some of the language. So it's interesting if one of Ed's comments, his answers had a particular word. I think a couple of times you picked up on that word and almost implied that he had permission, if you like, to expand on it a little bit. How did that feel for you?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was sound advice as well. From Holly about sort of replaying that back. I guess it also really sort of shows to him that I'm also really listening to him as well. Whereas before, the normal dynamic of our conversation is that we sort of really turn take. I think in being able to really demonstrate that I'm listening to him, partly through the pauses and partly through repeating back some of his language, it really, although it was obviously clearly difficult for him, I think it gave him more space and more permission to step into.
Interesting. All right, and Ed, over to you. Did any of those pauses feel uncomfortable, or what was your mood during those pauses?
Yeah, no, it did initially make me feel uncomfortable, particularly the to pose when Charlie kind of posed that back to me. Normally we just chat away, and the words don't really seem to have that much meaning at times, if you like. And all of a sudden, I was aware that actually what I was saying, he was really listening to and examining almost. And it did initially make me feel uncomfortable rather. But then it kind of made me feel like this conversation's not like the ones we've had previously, and it felt like a different kind of atmosphere where, I don't know, it just felt like this wasn't a surface conversation, that he did want to find out more about me for once. And not in a negative way, but it did make me want to open up more, definitely.
Okay. All right. Charlie, Ed, our actors, thank you both very much for that. So, Holly, just a final thought from you, I suppose. Certainly the effect I was getting from Ed there, the fact that Charlie had picked up on that word "suppose," sort of, I got the impression it was more of a sort of a proper conversation, a real engagement going on there. Was that your feeling?
Absolutely. Yeah. Proud therapist watching you. So, but also the reality too is we say that in jest, but the truth is this does take time, and it takes practice for conversations to happen like this between friends, between couples, between employer, employees. This is something that you can learn, absolutely, but that it does take practice to do. So you can keep doing it.
And practice does indeed make perfect, doesn't it? So, okay, well, fascinating. Thank you all very much indeed. Some interesting food for thought there when it comes to getting men to communicate, whether you're a guy yourself or whether you're a woman trying to get husband, boyfriend, father, son, whoever it might be, to say a little bit more. Some really interesting thoughts there. So that's for all from us here at the Stoke for this seminar, but do be sure to join us at the next one in a few weeks' time. Thank you very much.